3, 2, 1.
Oh yeah, okay. I don't see anything though. It appears to me. Yes, okay, it's working. We're
All
live.
right. We are live indeed.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna jump into it, yeah?
Let's do it.
Okay, everybody. Hi again. It's Balach over here and myself, Wei Lin. Today we're gonna talk about a hot topic for everybody, the most controversial topic of all, more so than politics and more so than God. That is
Steak or beans?
steak or beans. Yes, thank you. I'm gonna put that in the title. So you can be healthy eating different ways, right? I learned about Rip Esselstyn, a vegan triathlete and advocate for veganism. He's amazing. He led the way for many people to follow in his footsteps. And on the other extreme, several MMA fighters, I can name Chad Mendes, who claimed that the carnivore diet helped his psoriasis. I think I pronounced that correctly. And another lady called female MMA fighter Alejandra Lara, and she credited the diet with her health improvements as well. So just right off the bat, I want to say that because I want to make it clear that we are capable, as human beings, we're capable of flexibility and variety in our diet. And we can be not just, surviving, we can thrive, we can be elite athletes, eating whichever way we choose. Now, however, we're here today to have a how do you call it, a face off between steak or beans. Yes. So, because everything in life comes with trade offs, and we're here to understand these trade offs. And to do so, Balach and I will be presenting our cases. I will be on the side of beans, vegetarianism specifically, not veganism today. And Balach will be taking the side of the steaks. Yes.
I'm going to give it my best.
Okay. And without further ado, Balach, please sip of coffee to brace yourself.
Indeed. So, just also to set context, this choice of roles is interesting because I've been a vegetarian for a long time, and we can get into that as well as I do all sorts of sports, right? So,
Right.
it's a great intro to start talking about mixed martial arts. So, having been a vegetarian, to think about why meat consumption can be good for you or is good for you is a very interesting topic for me. The way I approached this research going into today's session was I thought, well, let's break it down into what kind of arguments do I hear, right, and on my side of the camp. And by the way, I'm not an activist for veganism or vegetarianism, but I have clear preferences. So that aside, one of the big things I often hear is when people talk about the dietary needs, right? There's this big argument that vegetarians miss out on certain things that a carnivorous diet provides. Another argument you hear sometimes is people talking about diseases that that vegetarians might be more prone to because of their diet, or meat eaters might have an advantage, or vice versa. I tried to think a bit about also food combinations. I also came upon a new aspect that I didn't think of before, which was a kind of racial or group adaptations. And then the latest thing that kind of is a bit more not fully baked in my mind is just general evolution of our diets and how we live in our societies. So, trying to put all of these things together, my approach was to look at blue zone diets. So, blue zones, for those who are not aware, there's a few places on Earth that are considered to be kind of particularly interesting and special for people looking at diets and their impacts on longevity and general health. And so Sardinia in Italy is this island sub-nation that is one of the blue zones of this world, where you have the biggest population of centenarians, and you have people, that is, people living into their hundreds or reaching 100 years old age. Then you have Okinawa in Japan, another island kind of subnation, let's call it, whatever the appropriate way of calling it. I do not want to get into that, but there's a distinct group of people who lives on these Okinawan islands, and they have distinct diet that seems to help them. You have the highest population of centenarians there as well in the world. There's the Greek island of Ikaria, which is another one. And so you have some of these places that have particular diets that have more or less been stable for hundreds of years, and people seem to live long, and they seem to live healthy there. Then I also try to look at some very niche groups, so Inuits and Maasai in particular, who often get dragged into these arguments and discussions about what kind of food is good for you. I didn't find much literature on Mongolia and Siberia, because in Siberia you also have tribes and groups of people who have seemingly meat-heavy diets, and apparently they seem to be doing well. I didn't get a lot of content on that, so I'll probably not go into too much of that. Now, the interesting thing about these three blue zones that I mentioned, Okinawa, Sardinia, the Greek island of Ikaria, is that their food definitely contains meat. So if you know Italian food, you know you have all sorts of pasta sauces that come with meat. You have pizzas that come with meat. There's also a lot of carbohydrates. There's all sorts of other things involved as well. If you think of Okinawa, you think different forms of sushi, perhaps more traditional forms of essentially seafood. And same with Ikaria. It's an island nation. You have a lot of seafood. You do have meat. What is interesting about all of these is, one, that there's meat, and two, in general, that meat seems to be coming from local sources. So it's not your meat bought at supermarket, but it is from farmers, locally produced, generally healthy meat. And these guys don't seem to suffer any bad consequences of that. So the thing that I learned from this part of the research was that having meat in your diet doesn't necessarily put you at a disadvantage, right? So straight up confession, as a vegetarian, I'm not saying at all. In fact, I'm convinced that having meat in your diet is not bad for you. As some people might try to convince you to go all vegan or only vegetarian, and that meat is the source of all evil. I don't think that is the case. And also historically, if you look at the history of the world, we know that we have been hunter-gatherers, we have been scavengers, we have had meat in our diets. And even our closest cousins, chimpanzees, or things like that, apes, gorillas, they have a dominantly vegetarian diet, but then they do eat ants here and there, and they do get some of their nutrition needs met from animal sources. So that was the first simple conclusion that I came to. One, meat is not all bad. It's okay. So then the question was, kind of, I got a green tick on it's okay to be an omnivore. And so then the question was, what about just being carnivore, or just going on a paleo diet, or really only eating meat? And what I got on that was essentially, I'll just summarize it. I might show some tabs that I have open here as well. But essentially, the summary of that comes down to certain diets, whether they're meat heavy or non-meat heavy, can have very positive impacts if you are aiming for certain goals. If you are suffering from certain diseases, changing that diet to let's say, more or less a singular focus tends to be helpful. So, as Vedin mentioned, you have some MMA athletes saying switching to a carnivore diet has helped them tremendously and improved their performance, and they feel good. And people get into all sorts of biomarkers and things like that seem to be showing healthy responses. I think that's very much possible. The opposite is also true, by the way. You have, for example, this thing called Gerson diet, which is a diet, according to its proponents, helps cure cancer. It is largely fruitarian, but personally, I don't think you can just completely live off a fruitarian diet either. It might be good for certain periods of time if that is what your body needs. So that's the conclusion on meat-only diets for me, that it can be good for a certain period of time, or for sure tends to be. Like, there's enough anecdotal evidence, there's some studies that help that as well. So that was the other thing. Now, going back to the blue zones, there was a question of how meat heavy are these diets, right? Is meat the contributing factor for the longevity and the health of these people?
Well, that's a
So
different question, isn't it? Like,
yeah. So if I was to advocate for meat, right, that would be the question I would like to answer. If I think if people are living long and healthy, and if they're eating predominantly meat, I mean that kind of answers my personal question of, am I going to be okay on my vegetarian diet, or should I start including some meat, or somebody thinking along those lines? So I started looking into this, and one of the population that people often present is the Inuit, and the other one is the Maasai population. So Maasai men tend to eat more meat than women. They tend to kind of have a fair amount of meat, or that's what we are told in their diets. And the Inuits have a lot of seafood, or seal and whale meat in their diet. And there were some studies from the early 50s that kind of indicated, the old style researchers who would say, I was there for 3 weeks and I saw these people eating all this meat and they were great. They were in great health. The meat did not seem to lead to any diseases in them, and they seemed to be doing well. What I found out later was, for example, I'm gonna share this link with Velin now first, and I will also share my screen. So let's see, window, and I'm jumping into this window. I hope you guys can see this. Let's give it a second to show up on the screen.
it's loading.
It's still loading.
Yeah. Okay. It's
And
clear.
here we go. So the first sentence here is kind of well known to consume significant amounts of whale and seal meat frequently. The Inuit are commonly construed to be heart disease free. This was one of the big conclusions from one of this early studies, and people mentioned that quite a bit. Now, the question is this an outlier? There's also other observational research finding that low processed food, low animal, and high plant diets to be associated with low heart disease death rates. Now, what was interesting here was that what we do know that Inuits eat a relatively lower carbohydrate diet and relatively higher meat diet. I'm just going to skip over some of these things and jumping to what about their risk of heart disease. Now, what this article says that this myth is so often repeated that it just became an unsupported truth. So there was a recent paper in 2003 relative to 1950s, which looked at autopsy studies and clinical observations and studies that actually proved that heart disease does exist among the Inuit. As you would imagine, I think heart disease has existed for a long time. It may not have been documented. What was interesting that kind of heart disease does exist. That was one thing. The other thing was that bone health among the Inuits was quite bad. So aging bone loss, which occurs in many populations, has an early onset and greater intensity in the Inuit community, and nutritional factors of high protein, high nitrogen, high phosphorus, and low calcium intake may be implicated. Now, there was something else here. So something must be going on, right? So you have a high meat diet. People generally seem to be healthy. What's going on? And there's heart disease, and apparently that diet is implicated in that. So I'm not gonna, since I'm not making the case for vegetarianism, I'm making the case for meat is okay. So how were these people still relatively healthy? Here's the other one. I hope you can see this one. Let me jump. Is this the correct one? This one. So here's a more newer study which showed high-fat diet made Inuits healthier but shorter, thanks to gene mutations. So this was the kind of data that was not available to us in the past. So this question of, is meat generally good for you, or was there something else going on? And this was the study showed that actually, and let me just jump straight here. People with genetic mutations that help them efficiently digest the food available are more likely to survive and have healthy children, who will themselves also inherit this capacity through their genes. And this would make sense, right? So if your diet is only meat, but you have a mutation that helps you work with that better, then of course it's good for you. So this new study analyzed genetic diversity in 191 people with indigenous Greenlandic Inuit ancestry, and then they compared their genomes with those from 60 people from Europe and 44 from East Asia. And they looked at specific genetic markers previously found to be associated with heart disease and metabolic disorders, and identified a cluster of genes that had undergone a lot of changes in Greenlandic Inuits compared to the two other populations. And these are these two genes which encode enzymes FADS1, FADS2, and FADS3, which determine the level of polyunsaturated fats. Now, I'm just going to jump to essentially here. The study authors speculated that the reduced amount of fatty acid in the Inuit population could compensate for the high dietary intake of omega-3, a type of polyunsaturated fatty acid, through fish and seafood. So there's a bit more about the impact on height and so on. But this kind of answered to me this question of, it is possible that certain populations have adapted over time to be able to essentially thrive off fat and meat diets. So kind of not necessarily that it's blanket good for you, but that, yes, it can be good for you. It's also not blanket bad for you. So this was interesting. There was some other data on Maasai as well. So Maasai eat relatively more meat, but they tend to have shorter lifespans compared to the rest of the population. Kind of a Maasai living into their 60s and 70s is a relative rarity. So kind of trying to put these two together, I'll repeat again, it's not that meat is blanket good or blanket bad for you. My conclusion was that if you have certain adaptations, as is the case now, we know with the Inuits, actually you can be in a way more adapted to a relatively more carnivorous diet, and that it would work for you. Then there were some, going back to the, let me just see, Let's go to Sardinian dietary analysis. Um, what is happening there? So there was something, if I can find the right amounts. Contrary to my expectation, the Sardinian diet is not meat heavy, but it's kind of almost around 25 to 30% of the caloric intake comes from meat. But there's a significant other 75% that comes from carbohydrates, sugars, legumes, etc. Let me see. Sardinian diet, Gerson diet, etc. Meat versus vegetable proteins. Okay, I'll start wrapping this up a bit because then we can go into more details and different aspects. So racial adaptation can help. Food combination is definitely a factor that we cannot take away. There was some evidence that a carnivorous diet can lead to colon cancer, or colon cancer is more visible or seen in people who are on a much more carnivorous diet. But I don't think that is so clear cut yet. So for me, to put it kind of all together, the conclusion basically was what I already said a bunch of times now. Meat is okay, especially, in fact, meat is great if you are from a population that has adapted to eating meat. I think a more omnivorous diet is better than just a carnivorous diet. And then from a personal point of view, my conclusion at the end of the day was that, well, I'm pro-choice. If you choose to eat meat, eat meat. I don't think I have enough basis to say that it's bad for you in any way. As a vegetarian, personally, I wouldn't recommend it. But I would leave some more things, like from my personal point of view. So this research did not make me change my mind on. It's not that tomorrow I'm going to start eating meat because it's great. It seems to be good enough. It's useful. Nothing against it. The things that I do have against it, I'm going to save for later when we get into a discussion, because it's an important part of my life. So I do want to discuss those aspects as well. But for the presentation on should you eat meat or should you not eat meat, oh, please, by all means, go ahead if that's what tickles your fancy and makes you feel great. I do accept the anecdotal evidence. That it may be that you're an athlete, and due to your genetic composition or your circumstances or the kind of workload and protein needs you have, it might be a good choice for you. So go for it. There was something also I wanted to add, kind of the bioavailability of meat. So proteins from animal sources seem like they are more readily absorbed than from non-protein sources. And so that might work in your favor as well, if that is the goal you have, to consume as much protein as you can. A high protein diet seems to be healthy in terms of not kind of running around with a lot of fat reserves around your body. If that is the goal, go for it. I think that would be a good point to cut and hand over to Vedin to see what Vedin found out. That's where I will stop.
All right, thanks, Balach. So it sounds like what I took away was that there are populations that are adapted to eating meat, but you said that the Inuit, it sounded like they had pretty poor health from what you were saying, and Maasai as well. So I don't really understand who is the ones with the adaptation and what is the benefit. There doesn't appear to be benefit to it, really.
No, so the thing with these two is that they seem to generally live healthy for as long as they live. They don't seem to have any benefits of longevity. So they don't live as long, but for as long as they live, they seem to be living healthily. And how do they define it? It's that they remain active in their lives. Masai actually have a huge amount of visible activity. They walk a lot. There are some studies that suggest that on average it's kind of like they have the equivalent of walking 20 kilometers a day, which is huge, right, compared to most modern humans, and especially those of us living in cities and working with computers. And their meat intake doesn't seem to negatively impact that. They have found also from these autopsy studies in Inuits and Maasai as well, is that they do have buildup of these fats around their coronary arteries, but their arteries are also adapted and slightly bigger in size, so they're not getting heart attacks from eating too much meat and fat that then builds up in their arteries, but there is a buildup. So that's the thing. They eat meat, they seem very healthy, they just don't seem to live long, but that's not necessarily due to their meat intake. So to be very clear,
Kills them then.
could be any number of factors. That's a part of research I didn't go into. Inuits tend to live in very harsh conditions. I mean, in like minus 40, minus 50 degrees centigrades in winter, higher with wind chill. Maasai live on the land. If you're walking barefoot on the land, you could have snake bites. You could have thorns that turn into gangrenes. That there could be poisoning from different foods as well. Maasai have an interesting practice. Young males there's this ritual more or less once a year. They go out and they live for 2 weeks and they eat mainly meat in those 2 weeks. So red meats, blood, other organs, etc. There's not that much research on it. They tend to develop at least acute symptoms of kind of food poisoning because of that. But it doesn't seem to have, or at least there's no studies that would show that there's a long-term negative impact. There's a short-term negative impact, which would be understandable. If you eat, I don't know, bread for 2 weeks straight, you will probably have gastrointestinal issues as well. So that seemed just kind of local impact of that very particular carnivore diet for 2 weeks straight for somebody who's not 100% carnivore all the time. So again, nothing, no minus points for meat there. It's just that part of the ritual. And the shorter lifespan, no, can't say much about that.
But it's not heart disease that kills them, it's something else.
No. So that they did not find. They, like I said, they found this buildup of fats around their arteries, but it was not that killed them.
It's really it's a bit odd that they tell you that okay, it's not heart disease, and they tell, but we did find this arterial plaque, and they do die. They do die young. They die young, and they have arterial plaque, but it's not heart disease.
Yeah.
And they conveniently left out the part where they're supposed to tell you, okay, this is what actually kills them. So just so you know, because they have this, what looks like pretty extreme diet, and everybody really want to know. So what, what was it do to them? What is it? How did they die? Did they have old age? They die of old age at like 35 or 45 or what is it? It's odd, like yeah, man, you're not doing it. You're not really
No. I
selling
mean,
it.
sometimes we don't have enough data, right? And this is where speculation comes into the picture. So one of the interesting things I learned, not in this research, but from before, is that we have often micro heart attacks. So in periods of high exertion or sudden exertion, a lot of us normal people, we suffer micro heart attacks that then are recovered from, and we are none the wiser. It doesn't show up anywhere. So not total heart failure from buildup of plaque or like sudden blow to the chest or something like that. And I'm just now wildly speculating that Masai, with some of their extreme, also in some of their rituals, they're just tall dudes standing and jumping high. I mean, that has an impact, and it could be that some of them do die because of the buildup combined with that
How
one ritual combined with another ritual. There could be freak accidents. There could
did
be other things that are happening. We don't know. I think what I want to emphasize is I'm trying not to fill the gaps where we don't know. And if I'm going to speculate, I say it out loud clearly,
yeah, I
because I think
understand.
we have this tendency of wanting sure answers. And oh boy, would I love to have clear answers of, okay, what exactly is going on with the Maasai and
But the
Inuits?
Maasai people are really interesting. While you were uh, presenting, I did a quick Google and CNN. I found an article on CNN that says the leading causes of death for the Maasai are pneumonia and diarrhea, for which two vaccines were introduced nationally in 2013. So I mean, they obviously they're dying of like really like seems like very preventable diseases, pneumonia and diarrhea. That's just
Yeah,
awful. Like
yeah.
you can't get them stuff to deal with pneumonia and diarrhea in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, we are, as human beings, we're very interesting, right? For example, you have a lot of deaths. Every time there's a cholera outbreak in India, there's a lot of deaths, and that's the biggest cause for that is general dysentery, lack of hygiene in the environment of those people. And so, can you point a finger then at their diet, or can you point a finger at lack of activity or other things? It's a bit harder one. So this is the world we live in. People die of all sorts of preventable causes.
Yeah, yeah. Also, did you see the photos of the Maasai?
I've seen some of the photos of the Maasai. Yes.
He, they're like not fat.
No, I mean, if you're walking the
I
equivalent
thought
of
you're
20
supposed to like
kilometers a day,
get super fat, like eating all that meat, and stuff.
no, it's interesting. I think one thing that has to be added is, oftentimes people say, "Oh, all the fats that you get from it," and well, if you combine it with a huge amount of activity, that is not necessarily like we have all seen pictures of tall Maasai men jumping 4 feet straight into the air, right? Not bending their knees, and we think how bad must be, how bad must that be for their knees? And it's like,
But
yeah,
the
but they
women
don't
are
do
not
it all the
fat too.
time.
The
you know,
women are not fat too.
yeah, well, they're all walking and working all the time, and that's the interesting thing also for the Okinawan and Sardinian people. These centenarians, I mean, they are active in their societies throughout their life. It's not that they look good and healthy till 60s and then they have a long period in old age homes. They're active all the time, so they're processing a lot of perhaps, let's say, even if they were eating unhealthily, they're processing a lot of that out of their systems. And that means, despite high fat diets, they don't look fat.
Yeah, they look amazing. Yeah, these are the jumping folks that you're talking about.
Kind of the
Yeah, these are
famous pictures, right? But it's not that they're jumping like this every day, all day long. You also have pictures of Maasai men running when they're hunting, but they're not hunting literally every day. They have some very interesting
yeah.
peculiarities. The link that I just shared has some images of the meat when they're on their meat retreat, let's call it. And that's for a vegetarian, it looks kind of almost grotesque, but it's okay. It's within a certain time frame. They have their rituals. They don't seem to develop long-term issues because of that. There are some short-term impacts, like I said, with anything else, you could get those. It's an interesting population.
So if they go on these 4 week long health refuge, and that half the Maasai men develop metabolic disorders, uh, that are what precursor to diabetes, why is it that they don't seem to get diabetes? They die from pneumonia and stuff and diarrhea. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sentence in that link that I shared, which is there's this associate professor at University of Copenhagen, Dirk Lund Christensen, who's been studying the health of the Maasai for the past 15 years.
Yeah.
And his hypothesis is that the risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease is reduced as dietary intake changes over a year due to changing seasons. So you have 2 seasons with rain and 2 seasons without or with limited rain.
Yeah.
So one of the other interesting aspect is that compared to what we eat, they have in a way they have a caloric restriction. They're eating seemingly less than what they should be eating. I think later we can get into what that really means. Is 3,000 calories the need across the population across the world? And also the impact of caloric restriction. I mean, by now we have all heard about intermittent fasting and how healthy that is for human beings. So in a way, they kind of have natural periods of fasting, you could say. So there's a kind of recovery built into the overall, let's say, seasonal intake of the food as well. So there may be kind
It's
of,
like
let's
a
say, their bad habits
combination,
are
right?
accounted for in some way.
Right, right. Yeah, the Maasai are really one of a kind. And thanks for sharing that. And the um, if I may, I just want to share something I looked up very briefly while you were presenting. I just did a quick Google search. There's this really old article, studies of nutrition, the physique. So this is, I think, in written in 1931. I think that's really nice because as we we studied these different tribes, I think one of the known issues that occur is that um, there are more and more of these, the Inuit and the Maasai, more and more adapting modern diets, modern lifestyles, and that uh, pollutes the data. So uh, the older research that we have becomes more valuable um, from that context because that will come from a time prior to the introduction of modern diets. So let's skim this real quick. It's just the abstract. So in 1931, there was a researcher named Orb. It says here, this report contains the most interesting and valuable account of the influence of nutrition and physical condition of two tribes, the Maasai and the Akikuyu. The two tribes vary markedly in their diet, the main one being carnivorous, and the other is vegetarian, and just as markedly in their physique. The full-grown male Maasai is on the average 5 inches taller, 23 pounds heavier, and with muscular strength some 50% greater than the full-grown male Kikuyu. The Maasai live for the most part on a diet with high content of protein, fat, and calcium. It's odd. So even in 1931, the researcher noted that they eat high protein, fat, and calcium, whereas the modern researcher noted that they had what, low calcium, was it? I think. Um, yeah, whereas the Kikuyu diet is rich in carbohydrates and relatively poor in calcium. Marked differences were also noted in the incidence of disease. The diseases common with Kikuyu are bony deformities, dental caries, anemia, pulmonary conditions, and ulcers. Whereas in the Maasai, rheumatoid arthritis and intestinal stasis. I think this is such a mark of an old article. I don't even know what intestinal stasis means, but that is interesting. Kikuyu also infested with intestinal parasites. The women of the tribe have on the whole a better diet than the men seem to suffer less from these parasites. Um, the details supplied with reference to diets are most interesting. In the case of the Kikuyu, differences were found in the nature of the food consumed by the men and women. The male diet consisted mainly of maize or millet, so corn or millet, whatever that is, or sweet potatoes. Whereas the females, while consuming the same staple, added more quantities of legumes and plantains and more of a use a considerable addition of green leaves. Right, so they probably got more protein out of the legumes. Common addition to the diet for the women especially was earth from salt licks, so they were getting more salt, which were also found to be rich in iron. So that's pretty interesting. They even broke it down into male and female. The Maasai diet of the warrior class consisted mainly of meat, milk, and raw blood. Apparently, under normal conditions, except when hunting, they consume a certain amount of berries. The warrior class eat almost no vegetables. The rest of the Maasai consume a certain amount, when available, of bananas, beans, millet, maize, etc. So apparently, so it's warriors who are eating mostly meat, and the non-warriors do eat some amount of bananas, beans, millet, and so on. Although I think it appears that in this abstract that the conclusions and the observations are generalized still. They say generally the Maasai health appears to be better. More detailed study of the nutritional state of natives was made by the investigator for hospital cases and of prisoners. Uh, in both cases, the food is ample as regards to energy and protein. Percentage of phosphorus would also seem to be adequate, but according to the standards of Sherman, the calcium was deficient. Various experimental additions consisting of mineral mixtures with or without cod liver oil were given to these basal diets, and the body weight of the test subjects went up slightly in all groups, but without any outstanding difference. There was a rise in the blood calcium in all groups, um, and the retention was highest in the mineral plus cod liver oil group, understandably. Observations on the growing boys, we're almost coming to the end, were also made. The growing boys thing I think is more interesting. The milk supplement was given, and that gave the best results, both as regards the increase in the body weight and the retention of calcium. Some interesting observations also made at a reformatory. Uh, so that was pretty interesting. Seems that they maybe need more calcium, and that may have led to. I can imagine, right? I made the connection that there was a calcium deficiency, and then the boys were given milk rich in calcium, and then they showed the best increase in body weight, like better growth. Yeah. Special attention was devoted to the incidence of tropical ulcer, particularly in relation to 140 of the patients studied. That's quite a number for tribal study. I think it doesn't sound like it would be that many. Um, Tropical ulcer is more prevalent among the Kikuyu, uh, and the difference maker seemed to be the inorganic phosphorus in the ulcer cases. So I think it's a lack of phosphorus that led to the ulcers, and the Kikuyu are certainly more afflicted. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Turned out that in 1931, they had what's this Professor Orr already had the idea to compare these tribes that lived in generally the same area, and it's I think I'll put this in the show notes for everyone to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these studies are also interesting, not just from a dietary perspective, but there's two things that come to my mind, which we can go into detail later on as well. One is that a more detailed study on prisoners and hospital cases, right? So that can also easily skew the results. If you're observing people under certain conditions, these might be people already deficient or out of context in a way. And I don't know how much of that it was. And the further back in history we go, the less kind of double-blind studies we find. The other thing of people seem to be deficient in calcium, and supplementing that with milk seems to help. I mean, that makes sense. Now the question is, how much calcium did they need, and which standard are we checking it against? Is it the standard of the European settlers? maybe the locals were fine, and maybe that is a factor in terms of their longevity. For example, it might be that they seem to be doing well, but they hit a certain age where that calcium deficiency seemed to be the limiting factor. So these studies are very interesting in that sense. There's some general assumptions we can make out of that, some conclusions, and then also they put up some questions.
Yeah. Yes. Uh, thanks, Blanche. Yeah. So you're the Maasai master now. So if anything, I think we would look to you to uh, inform us consequently of any follow-up studies, any difference in the populations, like we know whether it's the villagers or prisoners, and then what were the effects, if any, of the interventions with calcium. So leave it to you. If you and thank you very much for presenting that. I think really interesting. It led to me to look into this interesting 1931 study about the Maasai and the Kikuyu. In fact, let me just send you the link so you can look into it further if you're interested.
Yes, and I'll just put one more here.
There's not a lot of free studies floating around. That's why I think open access journals are so important. But that this at least gave a really nice lengthy abstract. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for presenting the case for meat, which ultimately I don't feel convinced by. But
Well, yeah, I don't either, but
I
that's
hope I can
that's what I
convince you instead that vegetables are better.
sure. Let's
I
give it
know
a
that you
try.
will be very skeptical, but I will take your, tough questioning head on. And yes, I hope
Let's
that I
see.
can, use the carrot instead of the stick, the carrot, literally, to make my case.
Let's do it.
All right. So I don't really need to show a lot of screens, but let us begin. So the way I want to do this is I'm going to say that there are three arguments that are very strong for a vegetarian diet. Uh, Now, before that, as a preface to that, allow me to say that food allergies are increasingly common. And I think just personal viewpoint that they tell us something about humans. What is good for us, what is not good for us, what some of us and more of us are sensitive to. What we should avoid, what we should have more of. So turns out, yes, I looked up food allergens in children and adults. So let's just go through them real quick. I got this from Hopkins Medicine. Um, Food allergens for children, the top food allergens are milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, so all kinds of nuts, I presume walnuts, cashew nuts, what have you, soy and wheat. Yeah. And these are for kids increasingly. So not a lot of people have food allergies. I think it's still in the single digit percentages, but these are the common ones that cause problems. And for adults, it is mostly the same: eggs, milk, peanuts, tree nuts, the same, fish and shellfish, wheat, soy, and sesame. And this I got from the American College of Allergies, Asthma, and Immunology. And these account for about 90% of all adult reactions. And this raises an interesting. This leads me to my first point, which is hormesis. Hormesis is the fancy scientific word for what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So there are things that plants contain that are not good for us. Like people with food allergies will know that, yeah, they have their allergies. Now some of it's milk, and fish, shellfish, crustaceans, all that. Leaving that aside, common ones, yeah, peanuts, nuts, soy, wheat, um, and they can cause real problems for for some people. Um, and what other kinds of things can cause problems? Well, now I can show you screen. So on the Harvard School of Public Health, they have an article about something called anti-nutrients. Have you heard of that?
No, I have not.
Yeah, anti-nutrients are a really interesting thing. Um, let's see. Let's take a quick look here. The term anti-nutrients suggests what they are. Whereas nutrients are substances that nourish you, anti-nutrients block the absorption of nutrients. They are naturally found in animals and many plant-based foods. In plants, they are compounds designed to protect from bacterial infections and being eaten by insects. I think they're being a little too narrow here. I think it's just to prevent themselves from being eaten. So these are some of the common ones. Gluco, glucosinolates in cruciferous vegetables, so broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, and they can prevent the absorption of iodine. Uh, Lectins, which are in legumes, can interfere with the absorption of calcium, iron, phosphorus, and zinc. So anti-nutrients, yeah, oxalates in green leafy vegetables, beans, nut, beets, then prevent calcium from being absorbed. Phytates decrease the absorption of iron, zinc, magnesium, calcium. Saponins interfere with normal nutrient absorption. Tannins in tea and coffee can decrease iron absorption. In fact, I've come across this factoid before that if you drink a lot of coffee, you ought to eat more iron because the coffee will leach off some of it. For people who drink a lot of coffee, and I consider myself someone who drinks a lot of coffee, I think these things no. Now, the point that I want to share, the takeaway here is that plants need evolve their own defense mechanisms. So animals can run away from predators, but plants cannot. So they have to evolve their defenses, right where they are. And that's well, I think that's why even among herbivores there are adaptations, right? Some animals can eat grass, and many others cannot. You can't eat grass, which is really tough. You may need to eat, young leaves, which are oh yeah, good example, giraffes. Giraffes need to be eating the younger leaves that are more tender, high in the tree, because those close to the ground are too tough. They're less adapted to those. So plants have all kinds of defenses, and they cannot eat some of these things, right? Because you'll get a tummy ache, you'll actually lose nutrients. So it is not too much to imagine that it happens to some people. Now, on the plus side, history, normal life has shown us that most of the time we're fine with it. Yeah. Which leads me to hormesis. In fact, some, like the cruciferous vegetables, which have these glucosinolates, yes, they can interfere with the absorption of iodine, but they do contain a chemical called sulforaphanes, which are wonderful, wonderful is a substance. So here we have a very short, mercifully short abstract. It just says, evidence establishes that sulforaphane is a hormetic dietary isothiocyanate to be a promising chemopreventive, anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer agent. So it does so by stimulating your body to be stronger. Literally, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger.
Mm-hmm.